I wanted to highlight for you a few things that stand out in Blackmail. And as a side note, I am recording this lecture before we've had our discussions about the film and before I've read your journal entries. So some things are things we may have talked about already or that you've actually written about already. But the first thing to highlight is simply the ending and the opening sequences of the film. As you read, Hitchcock originally wanted a different ending, an ending where Alice is arrested for murder, and we'd have seen a repeat of the opening sequence. We'd essentially have had another sequence where the police, including Frank, arrest a criminal, and we see the whole police process, the booking, fingerprinting, jail cell, etc. Only instead of an anonymous criminal that we saw in the beginning, we'd have seen Alice go through that torturous process, not an anonymous criminal anymore, like in the beginning, but someone we know, and someone we know was acting in self defense, an essentially innocent person caught in the justice system. Now, the film's producers thought this ending would be much too depressing, and so Hitchcock compromised with another ending, just like he did with The Lodger when he had to give up his original idea. So, one thing that we can continue to reflect on is the ending that we did get, the ending that is essentially a compromise for Hitchcock. And this ending that now doesn't mirror the opening sequence as Hitchcock had originally planned. We can ask, with this ending that we do have, what does it resolve? And what doesn't it resolve? Is it perhaps more or less depressing than an ending than the original idea? I don't want to dictate to you, or I don't want to dictate to you what you should think about the new ending. But a few things do stand out to me that I think are notable. First of all, the ending is really still not a happy one. We have this couple, Alice and Frank, who now share a guilty secret, a secret that surely will haunt them their whole lives. They know the blackmailer was innocent of the artist's death, and yet Frank, a policeman, pursued him until the blackmailer died. And in a sense, then, Frank and maybe even Alice caused the death of the blackmailer in order to protect Alice. And I think that we see the visual anguish of that on Alice's face. It's a really, I think, wonderfully haunting, unsettling, ambiguous ending to leave us with. Quite gutsy, actually, of Hitchcock, even if he didn't get the entirely bleak ending that he wanted in the first place. Another thing that stands out to me relative to the ending in the beginning is the fact that once we know the ending, the opening sequence has a whole different feel. The ending, where we have an innocent man, the blackmailer who has died and he's been accused of a murder he didn't commit, that, I think, makes us question the whole opening sequence. In that opening sequence, we see the police doing their jobs. We see the wheels of supposed justice moving. But by the end of the film, we know that there are fallible men like Frank on the police force. And I think we have to ask, because of the story that we've seen, were the policemen actually right in their arrest of the man in the beginning? Can we trust them in their idea of justice? Was justice done in the beginning with the arrest of that anonymous man whose story we don't actually know? We know that justice certainly wasn't done in the end. So, how can we trust that justice was done in the beginning? It's a question I think that the film leaves quite open ended, and it's typical of Hitchcock to give us this kind of morally ambiguous question to think about. Another point to think about in the film is the significance of the scene in the tea shop. It's quite an extended scene, and I think upon first watch, we might wonder why it's needed in the film. But let's just kind of think about some of the details. So we have this crowded tea shop, something that we're not really used to in the United States, but it's a very classic early 20th century London setting. And here it really sets the scene that the story that we're about to see will happen right in the midst of a busy London. So it's this idea of kind of a very ordinary life, ordinary people, and in an ordinary London kind of setting. One key thing, too, that I think the tea shop scene sets is it establishes this rather uneasy relationship between Alice and Frank right away. We see that they have some disagreements. Frank seems mostly interested in his job as a policeman, and Alice wishes he'd pay more attention to her. So we then have this theme of love and duty, or the tension between love and duty, set up for us right away. She is angry because he's late for their date because of his police duties. But the great irony as the film goes on is that he will end up giving up his duty as a policeman out of love for Alice. And in the tea shop, he makes this comment: do you expect the entire machinery of Scotland Yard to be held up for you? A kind of a throwaway comment in the moment, a sort of teasing comment. But of course, later on, he does actually use the machinery of Scotland Yard to pursue the blackmailer and throw the other policemen off Alice's involvement of the death. So it's a pretty significant, I think, point of irony. In the tea shop, too, we also see some foreshadowing of the couple switch. We have Alice seated with someone else's husband for a moment in the tea shop. And then in a little while, of course, she's going to be hanging out with the artist instead of Frank. So there's a couple swap there. And then there's another bit of foreshadowing, too. In the tea shop, Alice loses her glove, and then Frank has to go get it for her, right? Or he volunteers to go get it for her. And then later on, of course, after the death of the artist, Alice loses her glove, and Frank again retrieves it for her. Only this time, the stakes of the lost glove are much, much higher. So it's kind of this contrast of the very ordinary that can suddenly spin out of control and become something that is just horrific and tragic. There's also in the film this theme that Hitchcock really likes of appearances versus reality. One critic notes, quote, thematically, the movie deals with the inevitable disparity between appearance and reality, the significant notion that physical appearances should not be confused with reality, and the constant reversal of normative expectations. So we might ask, what are some of the specific instances where the film explores appearance versus reality, that appearances versus reality disparity? Where do things appear a certain way but are in fact wholly the opposite, or at least a whole lot more complex than they appear? A few examples. I think the laughing jester painting is one significant part of it. And the laughter in the painting is this silent laughter, and I think there's quite a deep irony in that silence. Alice and Frank ultimately remain silent about what they know about the artist's death, and yet there is a witness to what happened in the artist's studio. It's this laughing jester painting, and he is a kind of witness, or a silent witness that seems to be speaking. He knows the truth, as it were, and we should also note that we as audiences, we know the truth as well, kind of with the jester as kind of silent witnesses. We share the knowledge with Frank and Alice and the jester. But the appearance of the painting, the laughter, the appearance of speaking, it kind of mocks both the reality of the situation, which is, of course, no laughing matter, but also the fact that it seems to be saying something vocally or out loud, and yet it's actually silence. And we can take an examination of the jester painting a bit farther, I think, and maybe ask ourselves, what exactly is the jester laughing at? Now, in this film, the meaning of that laughing face changes. Essentially, when Alice's circumstances change, the meaning of the painting, or the meaning of the laughter, changes. And that laughing picture really highlights the fact that the outside of something, the appearance of something, or the appearance of a person may look exactly the same, but psychologically or internally for that person, everything has changed. By the end of the film, Alice appears to be the same person that she was at the beginning to an average observer. But we know that she has been forever transformed internally by what she's experienced. And her assessment of the laughing of the jester also then changes because of what she's experienced. And the first time she sees it, she kind of laughs as if it's a real joke. It has no real weight. But by the end, the painting is almost mocking her and her pain. A few more quick instances of appearances versus reality. We have, of course, the artist himself. He is this openly charming person, but actually he's a sexual predator. We have Alice, a blonde woman, which often in film and in media generally indicates a kind of a sweetness and an innocence and a naivety. But of course, by the end, she's hiding this really terrible and soul destroying secret and trauma. And Frank himself, he's supposed to be the embodiment of law and justice, and yet he implicates a man he knows is innocent, and that man dies because of it. And Frank never confesses. He is effectively a cop who is guilty of murder. And then we have the blackmailer. He's also quite an interesting figure, Tracy, the blackmailer. On one level, he's certainly the criminal he appears to be. He's even visually linked to other criminals in the police records. He falls under this kind of mass group of people under the label quote unquote criminal. And yet we know the reality that he might be kind of a petty thief and a blackmailer, but he is not the murderer that everyone assumes he is. So he can't really be lumped together under this tidy title of criminal. Another key part of the film to highlight is simply Hitchcock's use of sound. One historian, film historian, notes Blackmail showcases Hitchcock's instinctive styles of soundscaping during a time period where little was yet known about the cinematic powers of sound. Now, in my video introduction to the film, I asked you to consider as you watch the film where you saw Hitchcock using and playing with sound to create an effect or to develop a character, to develop tension, to develop a theme. And here are just a few examples. So, in the very beginning, Hitchcock chooses to withhold the exact conversation of all the policemen as they are milling around after their very successful arrest. We get this kind of hubbub of conversation, but we realize the exact words aren't of much interest. So, the very first use of dialogue in the film, where these police are talking in the washroom, is kind of doubly frustrating, and I think intentionally so on Hitchcock's part. The conversation itself, what they're saying, is quite banal and ordinary, and it doesn't really matter exactly what they're saying, and it's also barely audible. So, I think the scene reminds us that sound films do not always have to have intelligible or even substantive dialogue. And in a way, the scene, I think, is a little bit of a joke on us as viewers. It kind of mocks our desire to hear by Hitchcock's selective use of this new sound technology. He denies us the ability to actually hear everything we want to, thus exercising his control over us as viewers. And that is really a testament to what he does throughout all of his films. He kind of knows how to play us as audience members, as it were. And in this scene, instead of hearing all the words, all the individual words, we just see this muddle of policemen and we see specific things, like we see the dangling handcuffs. And it's sort of that's where Hitchcock really wants us to focus. Rather than the words, it's this visual that really interests Hitchcock and that he wants us to pay attention to. There's no image of this next one, but just another quick example of when Hitchcock withholds sound. If you remember, as Alice and the artist, they're approaching his apartment and they're standing outside his apartment, and the blackmailer, who we'll come to know as Tracy, he calls the artist away for a moment to talk to him, and the artist goes out of the frame, but all we really hear is mumbling. So we don't hear what the blackmailer is saying to the artist, and we don't even really see the blackmailer clearly at that point. So we're sort of kept in suspense in a way, and we are pretty fully in Alice's perspective at that point. She doesn't hear what's being said by the blackmailer, and we don't either. And of course, the irony is if perhaps she had heard what the blackmailer was saying to the artist, she might have had a warning and she would never have gone up to the artist's studio. But of course, she doesn't hear, and so she goes up. Another instance of sound, which is a little bit later after this, is the instance of Alice's screams for help, which go unheard by the policeman that's right outside. One film critic describes it this way, the scene this way. He says, as Hitchcock cuts to a view of a policeman walking casually down the sidewalk outside, we hear Alice scream, "Let me go, let me go." Her screams are unheard by the policeman, thus creating a feeling of isolation from the outside world. With the use of simple juxtaposition of sound not reaching a would be hero's ears in a time of crisis, Hitchcock uniquely creates a desperate situation. So in this instance, we really feel the impact of Alice being totally alone. And in Hitchcock's first sound film, we have these screams of his protagonists not being heard by the people who need to hear them most. So it's a beautiful use of sound in his first sound film, and it really heightens our sympathy for Alice and immerses us in her perspective and just the helplessness and isolation of her perspective. Another related, really interesting instance of silence is where the artist's silence as he is attacking Alice, and also as he is dying, and then there's also this silence after his death. One critic puts the scene this way: the artist makes no sound as he's attacking Alice. Alice screams of panic continue rhythmically with each breath, and then gradually subside as her attacker falls limp. The room fills with silence. Finally, the artist's hand flops silently out into view, indicating that he is now a corpse. Silence continues as Alice stands up, carefully places the knife back on the table, and stands in shock. Only after a long, tense silence does the musical score begin, resembling the very piano piece that the artist had been playing. So, one thing to note about this really chilling scene kind of going forward, while I wouldn't consider this scene a murder, Alice was clearly defending herself. There is a motif of silent murders in Hitchcock that I think is quite interesting and notable. These silent murder scenes would really become a hallmark of Hitchcock's aural style. And we'll see in Strangers on a Train, for example, where a woman is silently strangled in a park. In the film Rope, which we're going to watch, we will see a man silently murdered with a rope. And in Rear Window, we will see a character who frantically is fighting for his life and he falls, but it's mostly in silence. So, something to think about why you think Hitchcock chooses these silent murders, as it were. A few other interesting uses of sound: Alice's scream as she's wandering around the streets of London and she sees this a homeless man, or someone who appears to be homeless, his arm, she sees his arm, and then that, as she screams, her scream dissolves into the scream of the landlady finding the artist. And we might note that both of these women are screaming at the emotional trauma of the very same death. Even though Alice is not looking directly at the artist, she is thinking of the artist. So it's this really beautiful thematic sound link where there's this one kind of united scream from two women who are in different places, but they're screaming at the same death. The phone booth in this film is also a really interesting space of sound and silence. As one critic notes, the phone booth in Blackmail becomes a dual private and public space as a way to allow the viewer to share in secret information with the characters and as a way to exclude others from the information. So, for example, the first time that Alice walks into the phone booth within her family agent's news shop, we as viewers are allowed this kind of subjective viewpoint on her guilt. So there's this nearby gossiper, this woman who is rambling on about the artist's murder, and we follow Alice into the phone booth. And then as she shuts the door, the gossiper's voice drops to silence as Alice closes the door. Then we are inside this phone booth alone with Alice and alone in that kind of silence. And she looks up Frank's phone number in the phone book. Instead of dialing the phone number, of course, she gets frightened by just seeing the idea of calling a police force. And so she opens the booth to leave, and the sound of that gossiper's voice comes back to us, still talking about the murder. So there was this kind of brief absence of murder talk in the phone booth, and it sort of allows us a way to kind of internalize Alice's desire to hide herself from the trauma and the impact of this death that she has just been a part of. Another instance of the sound and silence in the phone booth is later on as Frank himself, he receives this update from the Scotland Yard, and he takes a phone call in the booth with the doors cracked open so we can hear. But then, just as his conversation gets a little more interesting, he closes the door on us as viewers and reduces his speech to mumbles that we can't hear. So the information at that point is deliberately withheld from us until Hitchcock is able to reveal it as this dramatic twist, or as Frank is reveals it in a twist to the blackmailer and also, of course, to us in the next scene. So these moments like this, where we don't get to hear what Frank is saying, and then we finally get to hear, it's kind of this moment of timed manipulation on Hitchcock's part, where viewer access to information is fully controlled by the filmmaker. We also have to talk about the famous scene where Alice hears the word knife over and over again. It's a really beautiful instance of sound, primarily showing us Alice's psychological state and showing us her trauma. As one critic puts it, dialogue has always been something which Hitchcock treated as merely sounds emanating from the mouths of his characters, whereas the story was revealed visually in other ways, by a glance, a close up on an object, a reaction. Hitchcock often portrayed speech from the perspective of a character's mind, either selectively manipulating the speech heard through their ears or projecting their internal thoughts as a voiceover. Often, too, a character is talking off screen while Hitchcock's camera pans toward an object or towards a reaction on someone's face. And so in this scene where Alice hears this word knife, the camera stays on this close up of Alice during the scene, and the gossiper herself who is speaking is off screen. So the focus is on the reaction of Alice with each utterance of the word knife, and we're really fully immersed in her perspective, both through the sounds, the ones that are just leaking through to Alice, and then again, we're staying on her face in that close up. We should also note the use of music in Blackmail. Hitchcock often strips the musical score away from his scenes, and instead he uses things like the act of singing or whistling as a suspense device. So, for example, the artist in the apartment, when he's trying to remember this song, it's this moment of we're not really sure who this guy is, but we don't trust him, I think, quite with Alice. And the suspense in that scene is related to the question of what will happen between Alice and this artist? Is the artist as nonchalant as he appears to be? And his whistling seems to be giving off this air of nonchalance, but is it really nonchalance that he's communicating? Another example is when the artist is playing the piano and singing and pretending to ignore Alice. But of course, the tension there builds because we really don't trust him, and we know that Alice should not be trusting him. Another example is when Frank is whistling when he comes to inspect the artist's flat. And that serves to build suspense because we know something that Frank doesn't. We know that he should not be so cheerful and nonchalant and whistling, but there's this really wonderful dramatic irony and suspense in his whistling as we wait for him anxiously to find out that Alice was in the apartment. And then one more example of this music in the film that characters are making is when the blackmailer whistles at breakfast. Of course, he is in the midst of having blackmailed Frank there, and he uses his whistling in order to goad Frank. And the tune he whistles is actually this tune called "The Best Things in Life Are Free." So that's, of course, a way of toying with Frank, and Frank certainly would have known what the title of that song was that the blackmailer was whistling, as well as Hitchcock's original audiences would have known what tune he was whistling. One final comment about silence and about Alice's silence in particular. Alice is mostly silent after the attack on her and after her accidental killing of the artist. And her silence is really an ironic commentary because again, this is his first sound film. And in his first sound film, Hitchcock uses silence, not sound, to show the paralysis of our protagonist. And again, by the end of the film, this central relationship between Alice and Frank is built upon the secret shared knowledge of that crime. And whether they like it or not, they are accomplices to a murder. And their silence, their attempt to cover it up, involves them in a shared secret. So the film kind of repeatedly associates silence with a kind of guilt, and with the inability to speak is equated with trauma resulting from a guilty knowledge. So, and the murder takes place in this silent sequence, as we noted, and that is the result of Alice's attempt to defend herself, which kind of began with her ultimately unsuccessful verbal protestation. She's screaming, no, no, and then she fails, really. And then there's the silence and this death. And Frank's knowledge of her involvement in that death really forces him to be silent as well, until he discovers that Scotland Yard is looking for Tracy. So, but then Frank, learning that Tracy, not Alice, is the one that's suspected by the police, he refuses to let Alice speak, and he interrupts Alice when she tries to implicate herself, when Alice tries to protest that no, it wasn't Tracy, it was me. Tracy even says, "Why don't you let her speak?" So Alice is silenced in that way. And then near the end of the film, after Tracy's death, supposedly the case is being closed, or Tracy's death supposedly closes the case, but Alice again attempts to speak. She goes to the police station to finally confess that she stabbed the artist in defense. And entering the chief inspector's office, she tries to hesitatingly tell him, she's like, I know who did it. But again, Frank steps in and silences her. He interrupts her and prevents her from speaking. Then the film ends with this final joke from this policeman who knows nothing about the events. He makes this joke about lady detectives, as he says, who are threatening to replace men. And it is, in a way, this joke that effectively seals Alice's silence. She's kind of forced not only to accept what the men say, what the men have dictated about who did this crime or who is responsible for this death, but then she also has to laugh at her own silencing. She has to laugh at the joke that this policeman has made. So this is a moment where Hitchcock's first sound film reveals itself as a work that is ultimately about the relationship between sound and silence. And it uses sound as a foil to kind of foreground our central character's inability to speak and the ways that she is forced into silence by those around her, specifically by the men around her. One of the other things we've continued talking about with Hitchcock's films is wonderful visual storytelling. I'm not going to go through all of those with you right now, but I'd really recommend you take a look at my screenshots of the film if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, and it will just take you some through some of the key moments and maybe trigger your memory about how Hitchcock uses visual storytelling. The film Last also has, which we've touched on these a little bit already, but just as a reminder, this film has, again, Hitchcock's recurring motifs and themes that he will come back to again and again over the course of his career. So we have, again, like The Lodger, we have this blonde leading lady in peril. Of course, here her peril is compromised by the fact that her peril turns into guilt, and she can kind of only get out of that peril if she implicates an innocent man. And then we have the likable, charming criminal. We could say that in a way, there are several kind of likable, charming criminals here. We have someone like Alice, who I think we would agree is not really a criminal, but in the eyes of the law, she might be a criminal, but she's definitely sympathetic. And then we have, of course, the artist. He's definitely a baddie, but he's portrayed as this suave, interesting, kind of charming person. There's that classic charming criminal character of Hitchcock's. We also have the presence of the birds, or Alice's bird. There's this cheerful chirping in Alice's room that kind of mocks her pain, very much like the painting of the jester that is mocking Alice by the end. In a way, the bird itself seems to mock Alice kind of unknowingly. There's, of course, the theme of guilt running through the entire film. We might ask, is anyone really free of guilt in this film? There's also the repeated motif of staircases. We have when the Alice and the artist go up to the artist's flat, there's 5 flights of stairs, and then Alice has to descend down them, 5 flights, tiptoeing down them afterwards. Then Alice coming down from her room after she arrives home, there's just kind of in shadow, and there's this kind of descent into this world that she's afraid to go down into. Then we have ladders and steps up to the top of the British Museum. There's this kind of upward theme there that the farther and farther you go up, the more precarious things are. And then even in the very beginning sequence, if you think back to that, the policemen, including Frank, travel up the stairs to arrest the criminal, and that's also in heavy shadow. And then there is also this motif of mirrors in the film. In the very beginning, the arrested man in the beginning spots the police in a mirror, and we see their mirrored image. Then there's this moment that Alice is looking at herself in the bedroom after the death of the artist, and she's trying to kind of rearrange or compose herself and wanting to cover up what she's feeling, but she looks at the mirror and it kind of reflects herself back to her, and it startles her. And then thematically, we also have some mirrored characters, which I'm just going to suggest to you and not tease out too much. You can think about a little bit, but I think Alice and the blackmailer are certainly mirrored characters. We have the blackmailer and the opening criminal. We already talked about their linking. And we also have Frank and the artist are kind of mirrored characters as well, would-be lovers of Alice. And then finally, we have this motif of falling from high places, where the blackmailer falls from the British Museum. So that's kind of again something to think about why Hitchcock uses that. One final note here: these are some of the sources that I used to, especially talking about the music and the silence of this film. So if you are interested at all in using some of those for your final essay, you are certainly welcome to use those.